Muted.
Hello and welcome everybody to this webinar about Clinarion's new version of the risk-based monitoring application. My name is Claudia Keller. I am the quality risk analyst at Clinerion. And let's have a brief look at the agenda today. First, we will give you an introduction to the risk-based monitoring process, which is then followed by the actual RBM system demo. We will then also give you some information about how you can get started with the system. And finally, you will have an outlook on the next upcoming events regarding risk-based monitoring. And the person who is going to talk to you about all that is Randy Ramin-Wright. Randy is the Director of Quality Risk Management at Clinerion and is responsible for the business development of Clinerion's clinical technology products. He has more than 20 years' experience in consulting, risk management, and implementing information management systems. It is also worth mentioning that he is a strategic ally and an active member of the Alliance for Clinical Research, Excellence and Safety, also known as ACRES, where he promotes the establishment of EHR-based patient recruitment and standardized clinical quality risk management services. Before I switch to Randy, I would like to mention that in case you have questions, please feel free to enter any questions in the chat box of your GoToMeeting section. We will then address these questions accordingly at the end of the webinar if there is enough time. If we are getting short of time, we will come back to these questions in a different way later. And now I hand over to Randy, please.
Yeah, hello there. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to present today. And I'd like to thank you for your registrations and your participation. And I'd like to start off by essentially developing a common context before we go into the system demo. And I thought it would be rather germane if I do that by basing that common context on some of the ongoing activities in the area of ICH GCP. As some of you probably well know, there's an ongoing amendment in that area, in particular an amendment which has a significant impact on risk-based approaches to quality management. And so regarding that, I just took the liberty of pulling out some aspects of that which are especially relevant for risk-based monitoring and show how they're addressed by our technology. So in particular, it's clear when you read through this document that they're very much looking for a systematic approach, but more in particular, they're looking for a way of prioritizing how you react when you, in fact, carry out risk assessments. So as you will find out based on some of your experiences or as you move forward, that there's always a wealth of possibilities to calculate different risks and risk indicators, but ultimately you're confronted with the decision of, which ones do you want to prioritize, how do you want to act accordingly, and so consequently a prioritized approach is quite important in that respect. Second point is with regards to site selection. In particular, I'll show you in the demo how we address this in terms of targeting your activities based on the outputs of the risk assessments and how that is a natural fit with regards to that. And finally, you'll see also within our system how our risk assessments are focused on two primary risk areas, namely with patient safety and data integrity. So each one of our risk assessments is translated and aggregated into those two areas. Okay, next slide, please. So before we move on into that, I think it's important to essentially embed our technology and how we apply it within the underlying process. In particular, here you can see that the top level here how the basic drug development process is depicted, everything ranging from a protocol concept through approval, essentially moving into study setup, and then as well as site setup, and then executing that study protocol as such. And what's especially important is that we're not just applying a single focus as far as risk assessments go. We are not only concerned with the site as such, but it's also very important to look at the overall study and carry out a corresponding risk assessment there. Our technology addresses that. We're not going to focus on that today, but it's especially important in doing a risk-based monitoring approach that first, the study as such is looked upon, is assessed in terms of the risk exposure that it contains, and then based on that, it provides an excellent baseline for moving forward when looking at the details of each one of the sites that you're planning on integrating into the overall trial. Having said that, the trial site risk assessment is what we're focusing on today, and with each one of these assessments, one of the key elements which come out of these risk assessments is the ability to essentially focus on those particular sites which prove to be of high risk, and as such we can also show how we have mechanisms in place to then point you in the right direction and focus on key areas which would be worth looking at in further detail. And beyond that, of course, it's not all about just doing risk assessments. It's about applying that, and applying that in such a way that you can drive your resource allocation by essentially adapting your functional plans accordingly. And in particular, for today, we're focusing on the monitoring plan. And so I'll also show you how our technology supports the essential setup and consequent or subsequent adaptation of those monitoring plans as we move forward. So with no further ado, then I will go ahead and start with the demo itself. So Claudia is going to pass control of the GoToMeeting to me, and then we can go ahead and get started with that.
If I knew how.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and show my screen. And yeah, it looks like we're in business there. We're now looking at the initial page on which you will be presented with when you log on to the application. First of all, it's a web-based application. It's operating in our Clinerion cloud. And when you log on, this first dashboard which we're seeing is presenting essentially 4 basic compartments of information for you as a user of the system. So I think for the demo it would be best to choose a role which would be typical for using the system, and I will consequently choose the role of the study manager. The study manager certainly is one of the primary users of the system, not only, but it's quite effective for having you have a first glance and understanding of what the technology can do for you. So what are we seeing here on the dashboard? So first of all, we're seeing here at the top the so-called site risk. And the site risk is a statement which informs us about the overall risk of the sites which are under our concern, for which risk assessments have been carried out. So in our environment here, there's currently 51 sites in the system which have had risk assessments carried out. And what we see here at the top is, as I had pointed out before, we calculate risk both for patient safety as well as data integrity. And so in each case, what we're seeing here is a distribution of that risk. And so the distribution is done according to the classical traffic light system. So we have high, medium, and low risk rendered or illustrated in the form of red, yellow, and green colors to facilitate that a quick information flow. In our example here, in patient safety, it's looking rather good in terms of the risk exposure. We have 0 high-risk sites, 4 mediums, and 47 lows. Whereas in the case of data integrity, it's giving us a different picture, a different message. Clearly, we can see up front that 10 sites are currently at high risk, 30 medium, and 11 low. And that's the initial information which is being presented here at this high level. And beyond that, we have, beyond the overall site risk, I'd like to take a few moments to point out that our risk model is such that we are calculating an overall site risk, and in order to do that, it's dependent on 2 basic quantities that we also calculate. We calculate a so-called site structural risk. What is that? The structural risk is essentially a reflection of the inherent risk that you have when you're dealing, in this case, with the site. So, for example, if you're dealing with a site, you'd like to know what level of experience he has, how many clinical trials has he done in the past, does the site have experience with GCP and training as such, and as well as experience in the given indication or therapeutic area, which is will be the focus of the trial at hand. And basically those various factors are used to then derive a corresponding structural risk. That's basically the baseline for that site. And with this baseline risk, or the structural risk of the site, we then proceed and calculate the process risk associated with that. And that process risk is essentially telling us to what extent or how well does this site actually implement the study protocol which is being provided with. And in order to do that, we then evaluate a set of key risk indicators. So in the system right now, as you can see here in this particular part of the dashboard, it's showing you that we've calculated 13 key risk indicators, as illustrated here in this graphic. In particular, it also highlights out of those the top 3 KRIs, the top meaning here essentially those KRIs which were the most often occurring that went beyond their quality thresholds. So when we calculate KRIs, that's what we're essentially comparing it to. And in this example here, it's showing you that the worst offender, so to speak, is the site inactivity KRI, followed by a delayed resolution of monitoring action items, and subsequently this lower than average number of adverse events. And so with this 3 basic risk components, you as a study manager immediately get a quick overview and some guidance into where the problem areas are, or at least the indications of risk associated with that. And then from there, you're well positioned to then drill down and find out more details associated with that. But before we do that, in conclusion here on the dashboard, as I pointed out before, we also have a risk mitigation tool in place here. A subset of those activities here are displayed here on the dashboard. So these are the risk mitigation tasks which the system has automatically generated for you based on some basic rules which are configured into the system. And here you can see that 48 tasks have been generated which have not been started yet, and 12 of those are in progress, meaning that the mitigation process for those risks has commenced. Okay, so having taken a look at the dashboard here, I'd like to now delve down into further details and further functionality of the system. And by doing that, I'm going to go ahead and drill down here and look at the site risk for a given study. And so by drilling down here, I'm going to select a study, in particular K23 is what I've selected so far. And I'd also like to not focus on patient safety right now, but on data integrity, as the results are more interesting for the demo purposes here. So first of all, as I mentioned, now we're looking at a particular study. Beforehand, we were looking at all the studies in the system and what the distribution was here. But now for one study, this one, we're looking at, in fact, 32 sites which are operating and providing results for this study. It was determined that 9 of those are high risk and 23 medium and so on. Down below it, you see quickly as a study manager, essentially, which countries are involved, how many patients have already been enrolled in each site. We also have the first indication of the results of the risk assessment, so the risk level. If I filter on that, I can very quickly see which sites are at high risk at the moment. And in particular, you can also immediately see the risk score or the overall risk score of each site. So this overall risk score is that indicator which tells us and how we can prioritize our limited resources in particular. So essentially, the higher the number here, the higher the priority that should be set on that based on the overall risk calculation. And so to take the example further, I'd like to choose one of these sites. I'll choose the lone site here in Canada. It's also high risk, namely site 130. So we're going to drill down and take a look at the risk profile for site 130. We'll stay continuing looking at the data integrity part of the risk assessments. And so here we see very clearly that the overall risk score is high risk. It's gone beyond that quality threshold. And we arrived at that particular result by looking at the two associated risks, in particular the structural risk, as I had pointed out before. And in this particular site, that was actually a site which had a low risk, so its inherent risk profile was low, so apparently it had the requisite experience. It has experience with GCP as well as in this indication and similar sorts of factors associated with that. However, if we come over here to the right and look at the process risk, we can see that out of the 13 KRIs which were calculated, 6 of those went beyond their quality threshold. And as a result of so many of those process risks going beyond that, what that essentially did together was then to arrive at an overall high risk. Consequently, drawing our attention, the system is drawing our attention to this site. So in addition to that, I'd just like to highlight that when we calculate this overall site risk, we basically look at all those risk factors which contribute to the impact. So if this risk does become actual, what impact will it have on that site, or in particular on the overall study as such, and detectability. So how well can we actually detect these risks is basically the statement going on here, and also the likelihood. So how likely is these risks going to actually become actual and have us be particularly concerned about that. So with no further ado, I'd then like to proceed and consider more in detail, look at the process risk. So we should see that there are 6 of these KRIs, but what are they in particular? Which KRIs have been gone beyond their quality thresholds? And when we drill down here, that's what this page is showing us. It shows straightforward fashion which KRIs we're talking about. We're talking about, as we saw before, lower than average number of AEs. So that's not surprising, since this particular KRI was one of the top 3. So it's not surprising that it's also affecting this site as well. But beyond that, we have others: higher than average early terminations, fast enrollment rate, and so on. And so all of these KRIs are gone beyond their quality thresholds. And so if we wanted to better understand this and know what's going on further, then we can also look at the details of each one of the calculations that went into these KRIs. So I can go over here, for example, to this details link. When I click on that, then for this particular KRI, namely the one whose fast enrollment rate, it's giving me some further insight here. It's telling me, how did it determine that? So what we can see is, first of all, it has a threshold of 3, but in particular, what is it comparing? It's comparing the particular enrollment rate of this site to the planned overall enrollment rate, and it's seeing quite quickly that the actual enrollment rate here at the site is almost 5.5 times more than what was originally planned. Consequently, the red KRI is shown here below. And what we see also below is a trend report. So the trend report is also illustrating graphically in a very simple fashion that the latest risk assessment is beyond this quality threshold. Consequently, it's here in this red or pink area, as well as the last risk assessment, and then the one here in July was okay, so that was below that, and consequently here in the green area. So here you get both the details as necessary, as well as a trend report showing you to what extent and how well the latest mitigations have been effective or not, and that's what I'd like to say here about the details. So as I mentioned here, now we're to the point where we've had an opportunity to get an overview of some risk assessments. We were able to drill down and look at some of the details to better understand what's going on and what occurred. But the next step I'd like to do is essentially go here to this mitigation piece. And so it's essentially saying here with these little umbrellas here to say we have mitigation tasks that were generated by the system, and if we follow that with the link, it will then navigate us to that part of the system, which essentially is the risk mitigation tool in the system. So here you can see that for our study, K23 in Site 130, we have these 6 risk mitigation tasks which were generated at some point in the past. You can see the basic status of each task. So we have some that are still in the new state, meaning they haven't been worked on yet. Beyond that, 3 are in progress or currently have been worked on or are being mitigated at the time. And finally, we also have one which was both worked upon and closed subsequently because the risk mitigation was implemented at some point in the past. Again, here, this is designed in such a way that you get a quick overview, and if necessary, you can delve down and get details as needed. So clicking on this details field, you can see, for example, when the risk assessment was done, what's the planned implementation date, who's responsible for it, as well as important details like what was the root cause of this particular risk, and in this case it was oversight by the PI was lacking, and then it gives you information about what sort of risk mitigations were put into place. And so in this case, I'll go ahead and proceed, namely to the risk mitigation form, because in that part of the system, it provides and facilitates the means by which you can document the results of your root cause analyses, which essentially enable you to tell the system what occurred and what did we find out by analyzing a particular risk. And so what we can see here is, first of all, in this form, it gives you the opportunity to assign to various people, in this case assigned to Dave, giving you contextual information here, so the sites, which study, what was the results of this particular KRI, among other things. But more importantly, it's showing you here below the possibility to categorically document essentially that root cause or multiple root causes. Of course, the world is not so simple as we like to think it is sometimes. Sometimes there are multiple causes to that, and so that can be done here. For example, in this case, as we saw before, that was due to lacking oversight, and as a result of that it was determined that the PI was basically interested in speeding up the enrollment for due to some research that he was focusing on and wanted to get the data in quicker. Basically, in this case, here's an example where their follow-up was scheduled with the PI, and Martin is responsible for that. And then, of course, you can essentially decide when you're going to plan this to be implemented by. So, and then subsequently, you have the basis for your mitigation plans, as well as monitoring activities for the future. So from here, and the final part of what I'd like to show you is another function in the system, namely a function data download. So in the data download module in the system, it enables you to do a number of things, but for today I'd like to focus on its ability to essentially get two types of information out of the system. We can, on the one hand, get all the information out that was the result of a risk assessment, and on the other hand, I can get all the results out which was due to the risk mitigation process. And so here for the example, I'm just selecting only the one site that we were looking at, and I could also filter even more, but it then will it'll download into an Excel file, and I'll open that up for you, and it will then provide me with the means to take a closer look. And here you can see there's a wealth of information in here. For the sake of today, in our limited time, I'll go ahead and quickly filter it to just one of those risk assessments, not make things so complicated. But here you can see that for the study in this particular site, it calculated, here are the results from the structural risks, the overall risk, as well as the KRIs, the process risk. And you can see here also that the risk mitigation related information is here. So if we just focus on those risk mitigation tasks that have some data in it, as you can see here, then it's providing you with essentially the information that you need to track as well as plan different activities for monitoring. So here you can see that Dave is responsible for this. This was the results as we saw before. This is the plan of action, and it has timing information as well of when this is planned to be implemented. And so having said that, I'd like to then conclude in our limited time by essentially sharing with you basically next steps. I mean, typically when you're working with this kind of technology, what we recommend and what we've done in the past successfully is essentially a first initial step translates typically into a pilot project of some sort. Why is that? That's because it provides, in a controlled environment, a means for you to get experience both with the new approach on the one hand and experience with the new technology on the other hand. And that being the case, these are typical steps which are involved in such pilot projects. Essentially, it's involving a few workshops which are used as a basis to then collect the information, discuss and plan the pilot itself, which then enables us to do things like set up and configure the system, train the pilot team, and then essentially get the ball rolling and enable you to then pilot that approach and technology and gain that experience, which then puts you in a position to better advise your senior management and moving forward. Having said that, I'd just like to point out that there's also an opportunity. We'll be at the next month at the SCOPE conference in Miami. There'll be another opportunity. I'd like to meet you in person. It's usually preferable anyway, and that's an opportunity to do that there. And as far as webinars go, we've planned the next webinar is about giving you an opportunity and insight into our other study quality risk assessment, which I had mentioned earlier, and that's essentially at the end of March is the time frame. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and your participation today. And but before we close, I'd like to give an opportunity to answer any questions which may have come in. So, Claudia?
So I can see here that there was a question from Kevin, and he asked, where does the tool get its data from? Is there an internal EDC or CTMS system linked to it, or is it consuming data from external sources as well?
Yeah, very good question. I can tell that the question is coming from somebody with experience with the approach. This is certainly a data-driven system. That means that the calculations as such are dependent on those data which are needed in order to perform these calculations. And yes, we primarily derive our data from EDC systems, CTMS, or any other safety system which might be holding the pertinent information. The way we do this is we have a set of web services which provides a standard interface, and the information that we required is pushed into those web services. And we do it in one of three ways. You can either do it with our standardized Excel-based possibility where you fill an Excel sheet. It does not require developers to do this. Non-technical people can do it by simply filling out this template-based Excel sheet. By pushing a button, it's then uploaded into the system and loaded accordingly. This is appropriate and good for things like a pilot or getting first experience with the system. But if you want regular production, which is automated fully, then we also offer the possibility of having a data integration as a service where we have standardized adapters which connect to leading systems, EDC and CTMS systems, to do the job for you. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's another question. What are the main statistical methods or models used to identify risk probabilities or outliers?
Yeah. Okay. So the means by which we calculate, well, first of all, we applied a failure mode effects analysis originally, which enabled us to, on the one hand, identify those risks which are associated with the underlying business process, and from there, applying this methodology, we then derived essentially for each risk the different, or for each failure mode, to what extent is this have an impact on the underlying process, to what extent is it, or how likely is it, and then to what degree are we able to detect that. And as I mentioned that before, and from there, this is translated into a means to calculate in each, for example, each KRI has a associated calculation or algorithm associated with that, which is used and is also normalized such that you can compare, for example, big and large sites and have a situation where you're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. Okay, so that looks like those were the questions for today. I would like to thank you very much and for the time today, and if you have further questions, then feel free to contact us offline, and I was happy to spend some time with you and share our new interface of the system. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.